I remember the exact weight of the silence in that dining room. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just fall over a room, it lands on it, presses it flat, squeezes the air out of every corner until all you can hear is the ticking of the clock above the mantel and the sound of your own heartbeat thudding somewhere behind your ears. 43 years of training tell you to ignore both. So I did. Gerald Whitmore, my son-in-law's father, a broad-shouldered man of 68 who had spent the better part of dinner telling anyone who would listen about his golf handicap, was on the floor beside his chair. His face had gone the color of old candle wax. His lips were moving, but nothing was coming out. His wife was screaming. My daughter Claire was screaming. Marcus, my son-in-law, was standing over his father with his hands out like he was trying to catch something that had already fallen, his face completely blank, his expensive dress shirt still perfectly pressed, the collar still buttoned to the throat the way he always wore it, even on holidays. Nobody moved. 7 adults in that room, plus 2 teenagers in the hallway who had gone dead still when the screaming started, and not one of them moved a single inch toward Gerald. I was already on the floor. I had been on my feet before I was fully conscious of deciding to stand. My chair hit the wall behind me. My reading glasses were off my face and in my shirt pocket. My hands were already at Gerald's neck, 2 fingers finding the pulse point, counting, measuring, processing the data the way hands do when they've done it 10,000 times before, and the body no longer needs to ask the brain for permission. "Call 911, I said. My voice came out flat and quiet, which I knew would cut through the screaming faster than raising it. "Right now. Tell them suspected cardiac event, male, late 60s, responsive but deteriorating. Tell them we're at 114 Birchwood Court. Go." Someone went. I don't know who. I was already somewhere else. Not somewhere else in the room. Somewhere else in time. I was 22 years old and I was in the red dirt and the heat and the noise, and the man in front of me was Staff Sergeant Delmore Achebe, and he had a sucking chest wound, and the helicopter was 12 minutes out. And 12 minutes was a very long time when someone was dying and your hands were the only thing standing between them and whatever came next. I was there, and I was here at the same time, and my hands remembered everything. "Sir." I turned Gerald's head slightly, kept his airway clear, checked his breathing rhythm. "Sir, I need you to stay with me. Can you squeeze my hand?" His fingers tightened around mine. Weak, but there. "Good," I said. "Good man. Stay right here." That's when Marcus spoke. He said it quietly, so quietly I almost missed it, under the sound of his mother still sobbing across the table and the distant voice of whoever had gotten through to the dispatcher. He was crouched now, a few feet away, staring at my hands as they worked, and his voice had lost every single ounce of the easy, practiced confidence he usually wore like a second jacket. "Wait," he said. "Wait. How do you know how to do that?" I didn't answer him then. There wasn't time, and honestly it wasn't the moment for that particular conversation. That conversation had been coming for a long time. It just needed the right circumstances to finally arrive. 3 years earlier, none of us could have imagined it would arrive like this. On the floor of a Thanksgiving dining room, with Gerald Whitmore's life hanging in the balance and Marcus staring at his father-in-law's hands like he was seeing them for the very first time. I want to tell you the whole story, because the full truth of it matters, not just what happened in that dining room, but how we got there, and what it cost, and what it taught me about the people we think we know and the people we actually are underneath the years, and the quiet and the ordinary shape of a life that looks, from the outside, like nothing special at all. My name is Raymond Earl Decker. I am 64 years old. I live in a town called Mill Haven, Virginia, which is small enough that the post office knows your name, and large enough that you can still feel anonymous on a Tuesday morning if you need to. I have a house on a half-acre lot at the end of Sycamore Lane with a vegetable garden in the back that I am frankly more proud of than I let on. A golden retriever named Biscuit who is 11 years old and has decided that the most important room in the house is whichever room I happen to be in, and a quiet life that suits me well enough. I retired 6 years ago from a career that most people in Mill Haven don't know the full shape of. They know I worked in medicine at some point. They know I spent time in the military. They know I was overseas for a while. The details have always stayed mine, and I've never felt the need to offer them up. You learn, after a certain age and a certain kind of life, that the people who need to know who you are will figure it out eventually, and the people who don't, well, sometimes you let them go on not knowing. Sometimes you let them fill in the blank with whatever comfortable fiction makes sense to them. My wife Helen passed away 4 years ago, October 14th, a Tuesday, just after noon, in the upstairs bedroom of this same house. With my hand in hers and the afternoon light coming through the curtains, she'd picked out herself 22 years ago when we moved in, and she said the bedroom needed something cheerful and yellow. Pancreatic cancer. She fought it for 11 months. She was the bravest person I have ever known, and I spent 38 years knowing some very brave people. Claire is our daughter, our only child. She looks like Helen. The same dark eyes, the same way of turning slightly sideways when she's thinking hard about something, the same quiet laugh that starts somewhere deep before it gets to her face. She was 31 when this story really begins. She worked as an environmental compliance officer for a regional water authority, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds and also exactly as important. She is thorough, careful, methodical, and kind in a way that sometimes makes her vulnerable to people who read kindness as weakness and thoroughness as an invitation to take advantage. I want you to stay with me, because this is a story I've needed to tell for a long time, and it doesn't get easier to hold when you keep it inside. If you've ever been afraid for someone you love, that deep, cold, animal fear that settles in somewhere below your ribs and doesn't leave, then you already know the country I'm going to take you through. And if this is already reaching something in you, please leave a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one deserve to be heard, and the people telling them need to know someone is listening. Now let me take you back to where it began. Before Marcus. Before the slow unraveling of things. Back when life in Millhaven had its ordinary, reliable shape, and I was still learning how to be a man whose most important daily decision was whether to plant the tomatoes along the south fence or the east one. My routine in those days was simple enough that I could almost set my watch by it. Up at 5:30, the body doesn't unlearn early rising no matter how many years you give it to try. Coffee on the back porch with Biscuit at my feet, watching the light come up over the tree line. A walk around the neighborhood, 45 minutes. The same route every morning because Biscuit had opinions about deviation. Then back to the house, a bowl of oatmeal, the local paper, and whatever the garden needed that morning. In the afternoon, I volunteered 2 days a week at the County Free Clinic on Hartwell Road. Not as a licensed practitioner, I want to be clear about that, just handling intake paperwork and sitting with patients who needed someone to sit with them while they waited. The rest of the week I had for myself. I had friends, but not many close ones anymore. Most of the men I'd been closest to in my working life were scattered. Some gone, some too far away to see regularly, some just lost to the ordinary drift of years. My neighbor Bill Calloway came by on Saturday mornings sometimes, and we'd drink coffee and talk about nothing in particular, which is the highest form of friendship available to men our age. And there was Father Augusto at St. Michael's, a small, precise man from Guadalajara, who had been in Millhaven for 30 years, and who had the most genuinely peaceful face I had ever seen on another human being. We played chess on Thursday evenings. He won more than I did, and he was gracious about it, which made it worse. The loneliness after Helen was real, but it was a quiet loneliness, and I had made my peace with quiet. Some people can't stand the silence after a long marriage ends. I had been trained to sit inside silence without letting it swallow me. That training has its uses. Claire called me every Sunday, sometimes twice. She drove up from Richmond on about 90 minutes, at least once a month, and we'd cook something together and watch an old movie she'd seen a dozen times and talk in the easy, unhurried way of two people who don't need to perform for each other. Those Sundays were the best part of my week, and I suspect she knew that, and I suspect she arranged her schedule around knowing it. She met Marcus Whitmore at a professional conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a Wednesday in September, 2 years after Helen died. She mentioned him on the Sunday after she got back. Mentioned him the way you mention someone you're trying not to make too big a deal about, which is to say she mentioned him 3 times in the first 20 minutes, each time as if it was incidental. There was this guy at the conference, environmental lawyer. He's based out of Richmond, actually, which is kind of funny. He seemed, I don't know, he was interesting. Interesting. I stored that word away and didn't say anything. I met Marcus for the first time about 6 weeks later, when Claire brought him up to Millhaven for a Saturday afternoon. He arrived in a charcoal gray BMW. clean, polished, one of the newer models. And he stepped out of the driver's seat in a blue Oxford shirt and khaki slacks that were slightly too pressed for a casual Saturday in a small town. And he shook my hand with a firm, rehearsed grip and smiled the smile of a man who had practiced smiling at fathers before and knew the mechanics of it. "It's great to finally meet you, Mr. Decker," he said. "Claire talks about you constantly." "She talks about you too," I said, which was accurate enough. He was 35, tall, about 6'2", with the kind of build that suggested former athletic ambition that had settled comfortably into regular gym attendance. His hair was dark and cut close. His teeth were very white. He was by any conventional measure a handsome man, and he carried himself with the easy authority of someone who had been told he was impressive often enough that he no longer needed to hear it to believe it. He brought a bottle of wine. He asked about the garden and said it looked beautiful, though I noted he glanced at it for perhaps 4 seconds. He asked about my military service in a way that telegraphed he wasn't especially interested in the answer, the kind of question you ask to check a box. "Oh, that's impressive," he said when I told him I'd served, without asking any follow-up questions. I didn't offer any. He was charming. I want to be honest about that. He was genuinely charming in those early hours, and he made Claire laugh twice in the kitchen while they were helping me set out the food, and the sound of her laughing like that, easy and light, the way she'd laughed before the hard years, was enough to make me want to believe the best of him. I tried. I genuinely tried. It was only once near the end of the afternoon when Marcus picked up a framed photograph from the shelf in the living room, me and 3 other men in uniform, somewhere hot and far away, a lifetime ago, and said, "So you were in the army? What did you do? Logistics?" That I felt the first small, cool breath of something I couldn't quite name. "I was a medic," I said. "Oh," he said, setting the photograph back down. "Huh." A pause. "Claire mentioned you do a lot of gardening now. The tomatoes are pretty incredible, honestly." That was that. I noticed it. I filed it. I didn't make anything of it yet, because one careless moment does not a man define, and I had made promises to myself about giving people the full benefit of what they deserved before I formed an opinion. The year that followed was the year I told myself I didn't have enough information. Claire was happier than she had been in a long time, and happiness has a way of making the adults who love you feel like whatever produced it must be mostly good. They moved in together in the spring. They got engaged in August at a restaurant in Charlottesville. And Claire called me from the parking lot afterward with tears in her voice and joy coming through the phone in waves. And I sat in my kitchen and said, "I'm so happy for you, sweetheart." And I meant it. And I also felt something underneath the meaning of it that I pushed down without examining too closely. They were married the following June. A small wedding, outdoors, at a vineyard outside Charlottesville. Helen would have loved it. I walked Claire down the aisle in the afternoon light, and she squeezed my arm and whispered, "Thank you, Dad." And I whispered back, "Your mother's here." Because I believed it, and I saw her eyes fill up. And then we were at the altar, and Marcus was smiling that big practice smile, and I put her hand in his and stepped back and did what fathers do. I watched. Thanksgiving that first year of their marriage was at Marcus and Claire's house in Richmond, a newly renovated colonial in a neighborhood called Westover Hills, with original hardwood floors and crown molding and a kitchen that Marcus had personally overseen the redesign of. A fact he mentioned 6 times across the course of the evening in what I eventually understood was not pride, but instruction. Gerald and Sandra Whitmore were there, Marcus's parents, driving in from their home in McLean. Gerald was a retired corporate attorney, big and loud and jovial in the way of men who have spent their lives in rooms where they were always the most important person. Sandra was quieter, watchful, with good jewelry and an immaculate blouse and a habit of touching her husband's arm when he laughed too loudly, like a fine-tuned instrument of social calibration. Dinner was beautiful. Claire had cooked most of it herself, which I knew because she'd called me twice during the week to walk through the brine for the turkey. She was a good cook. She'd gotten that from Helen. Midway through the meal, Gerald was telling a story about a case he'd worked 30 years ago, something involving a senator and a land deal in the Northern Neck, and Marcus was laughing in the appreciative, slightly performative way that sons laugh at their father's stories, and Sandra was touching Gerald's arm, and Claire was smiling, and I was eating my green beans and being content to be exactly where I was. Then Marcus said casually, to no one in particular, gesturing toward me with his fork, Raymond's the quietest guy in any room. Dad, did I tell you? He used to be in the army. He mostly gardens now. Gerald looked at me with the benevolent, slightly distracted interest of a man encountering something mildly curious. Is that right? Well, good for you, Raymond. Good for you. I said, "Thank you, Gerald," and went back to my green beans. Marcus said, still with that easy smile, still with the fork, "He's amazing with tomatoes. Seriously, best tomatoes I've ever had. You'd think that was a joke, but I'm completely sincere." The table laughed. Claire laughed too, a little, but I saw her glance at me, just for a moment before she looked away. It was a joke. I understood that. But jokes have targets, and the target of this one, the sweet, simple old man who grows tomatoes and sits quietly at the end of the table and doesn't contribute much to the room, was not quite the shape of the joke Marcus thought he was telling, because he thought that shape was accurate, and the distance between what he believed to be true and what was actually true was going to matter eventually. It always does. The incidents that followed happened the way these things always happen, one at a time, spaced out enough that each one is easy to dismiss, close enough together that the pattern is there if you're willing to see it. I was willing. I just didn't know yet what I was going to do about it. Christmas that year. I drove down to Richmond on the 23rd, biscuit in the back seat, a bag of gifts in the trunk. Marcus's sister and her husband were there, and a couple of their friends from the neighborhood, and Gerald and Sandra again. It was a full house, cheerful and loud, and I was happy to be in it. At some point in the evening, Marcus was talking to his brother-in-law Derek about a news story he'd been following, something to do with emergency response times in urban areas, and whether private ambulance contracts were more efficient than municipal services. It was a subject I knew something about, more than something. I had spent 3 years after leaving the Army consulting for a hospital network on exactly this category of question. I mentioned it, briefly offering one specific data point I thought was relevant. Marcus looked at me with an expression that lasted perhaps a second and a half, a small, sliding expression too quick to be obvious. And then he said, very pleasantly, "Huh, that's interesting. Where did you read that? Not where did you learn that? Not how do you know that? Where did you read it?" As if the only possible source for anything I might know was a newspaper article. As if the category of person who learns things from experience, from years of doing, from the accumulation of the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from reading anything. As if that category simply did not include me. I looked at him for a moment. "I didn't read it," I said. "I worked on those studies." He smiled. "Oh, sure, of course." "Right." And moved on. Derek glanced at me with slightly more interest after that, but Marcus had already redirected the conversation, and the moment passed the way those moments pass, quickly, without record, leaving only a faint residue. Easter, a dinner at their house again, just the 3 of us this time. Marcus arrived home late from the office, phone in hand, mid-conversation with someone, and spent the first 20 minutes of the meal with the phone face up on the table beside his plate. Claire set out the food quietly. She had spent most of the previous day cooking. Marcus barely looked at the table when he sat down. "This looks great, babe," he said, still reading something on his screen. She said, "Thank you," in a voice that was careful and small, and she sat down, and she arranged her napkin in her lap with very precise, deliberate movements, and I watched her do it, and I felt something in my chest tighten into a fist. She didn't say anything about the phone. She didn't say anything about the 20 minutes. She just served herself quietly and passed me the bread and asked me about the garden. I told her about the garden. I kept my voice easy and my eyes off Marcus's phone, but I was watching him. The way I watched that night was the old kind of watching, the kind where you're not in the room anymore, not really, where your face is still at the dinner table, but your mind has stepped back and out and gone somewhere high and still and cold, and from up there you can see the whole geometry of what's in front of you. He put the phone down eventually. 8. Told me about a case he was working on, something involving wetlands mitigation credits. And I listened and asked reasonable questions, and he warmed to the conversation in the way people warm when they're being listened to by someone they don't entirely respect, which is a particular kind of warming that has its own specific temperature. Then he said, over dessert, leaning back in his chair with his wine glass tilted at an angle that was just slightly too casual, "Raymond, honest question, Do you ever get bored, like just day to day? Because I think I'd go completely insane if I didn't have something demanding to work on. I don't know how people handle retirement. Claire said, Dad keeps busy, Marcus. Oh, absolutely, he said. I'm not trying to be, I just mean I admire it. I think I just need more, intellectual stimulation. He said it gently. He said it with the smile. And I thought of the 43 years of intellectual and physical and emotional demand I had navigated. Decisions where the wrong call meant someone didn't come home. Triage in conditions that would have taken apart a man who needed intellectual stimulation from a conference room to feel alive. And I said, it has its satisfactions, and poured myself a little more water. But I watched Claire. She had gone very still when he said it. Her fork was suspended over her plate, not moving. Her shoulders were up, just slightly, in the way shoulders go when a body is bracing for something without knowing yet exactly what. She caught my eye and then looked away, too quickly. It was that look, the quick away-turning, the practiced neutrality of it, that told me what I hadn't been willing to name yet. July 4th. There was a cookout at the house next door. Their neighbors, a couple named Pete and Donna Sherrill. Good people, loud and warm and full of easy hospitality. Half the street was there. I had driven down for the holiday weekend and was standing by the drinks cooler with Pete, who was the kind of man who knows exactly 3 things about barbecue and will tell you all of them with complete conviction, and who I had immediately liked for exactly that reason. Marcus was across the yard, holding court with a group of people I didn't know, doing that thing he did very well. The wide gesture, the bright laugh, the sentence delivered at just the right volume to draw the room in. He was effortlessly social in group settings, which I had noticed from the beginning. The version of Marcus that a room full of near strangers saw was genuinely impressive. He glanced over at some point and saw me standing with Pete and Biscuit at my feet, and he said something to the group around him, low enough that I couldn't hear it over the general noise. One of the men in the group laughed. Another one looked over in my direction and then away. I didn't know what he'd said. I didn't need to know exactly. About an hour later, I was helping Donna carry some dishes back inside. She'd waved off Claire's offer of help, and I'd just picked things up because it seemed like the right thing to do. And Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. Raymond, he said it pleasantly, the way you say someone's name when you're about to make a small performance of being friendly. You don't have to do that, man. You're a guest. I don't mind, I said. Seriously, it's fine. Donna's got it. He took the stack of plates from my hands. Not roughly, but firmly. Like relieving a child of something they shouldn't be carrying. Go relax. You deserve it. Just an old man who likes gardening. Let other people handle the heavy lifting. He said it with the smile. He said it the way you say a thing you think is innocent. He'd said it before, or variations of it. Raymond's the quiet one. Raymond's the gardener. Raymond's retired. Raymond doesn't need to worry about all this. And each time it had been framed as affection, as protectiveness even. And each time I had let it go because you do, for as long as you can, for the sake of the person in the middle. But this one he said in front of Donna. And Donna looked at me with a small, involuntary expression of something that might have been pity or might have been discomfort, and then busied herself at the sink. I looked at Marcus for a moment. I've got it, I said, and took the plates back. He blinked. And then he laughed once, and went back outside. Donna said, He means well, without quite looking at me. I know, I said. I didn't know, but I said it because there are things you say in borrowed time. 2 weeks after the 4th of July cookout, Claire came to Millhaven on a Saturday without Marcus. This was not unusual. She came without him sometimes, and I never asked why, and she never explained, and we both pretended this was simply the normal logistics of 2 busy people with different schedules. She was quieter than usual. She helped me in the garden for a while. She'd always liked the garden, even as a kid, though she inherited Helen's appreciation for it rather than any particular aptitude. And then she sat on the back porch steps with Biscuit's head in her lap and watched me work. The afternoon light was long and golden, the way it gets in Virginia in July, and the fireflies were beginning to come up in the far corner of the yard near the old oak, and it was objectively a beautiful evening. I had just finished staking the second row of beans when I noticed she had gone very still again, the specific kind of still. I set my stakes down and walked to the porch and sat beside her. I didn't say anything. With Claire, you don't lead with the question. You create the space and you wait. She said after a while, "I'm fine." "I know," I said. Another stretch of quiet. "He doesn't do it on purpose," she said. I didn't ask what. I said, "Okay. He has high standards. For himself, for everything. And sometimes that comes out sideways." "Okay," I said again. She turned to look at me, and I saw it then. Not a bruise, nothing that simple or obvious, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has been spending months managing the emotional weather of someone else's moods, someone else's needs, someone else's definitions of what is acceptable and what is not. It is a very specific kind of tired. I had seen it before, not in someone I loved, not like this, but I had seen it. "Claire," I said. "Don't," she said. "I'm not going to say anything." "You're using the voice, Dad." "What voice?" "The quiet one. Where you don't say anything, but it's somehow louder than if you'd shouted." I almost smiled. "Your mother used to say the same thing." She looked back at the yard. She was right. We sat there for a while longer, the fireflies coming up in earnest now, Biscuit sighing enormously and shifting his weight onto Claire's knee. She reached up at one point and tugged her sleeve down, and I was almost certain it was a reflex rather than a deliberate action. But I stored it the way I store everything, quietly, without comment, in the place where I keep the things I'm not ready to open yet. Before she left that evening, she hugged me at the door, and I held her for a moment. And she said into my shoulder, quietly, the way you say a thing when you need it to be said but you're not ready for it to be a full conversation, "I'll figure it out, Dad." "I know you will," I said. "If I ever needed you, really needed you, I'd let you know." I pulled back and looked at her. How would I know if I need to come? She thought about it. She'd been thinking about it for longer than this conversation, I could tell. She said, "If I ever call you and I ask you whether you planted the evening primrose yet, that's a thing I would never ask. I hate evening primrose. You'd know." "I'd know," I said. She nodded. She kissed my cheek. She got in her car and drove back to Richmond, and I stood in the doorway and watched her taillights until they turned the corner. And then I stood there a little longer in the dark. Thanksgiving arrived the way Thanksgiving does, with the same sudden, seasonal violence of a season that has been waiting just outside the door and finally decides it's time to come in. The weather had turned hard and gray the week before. The trees on Sycamore Lane had gone bare almost overnight. I drove down to Richmond on the Wednesday evening, Biscuit in the back with his blanket and his rubber duck, the back seat smelling of dog and old upholstery and the particular brand of contentment that comes from knowing exactly where you're going. I didn't know what that evening would become. That is the thing about the worst moments. They don't announce themselves. They arrive dressed like every other evening. A table set for 8, a turkey in the oven, Gerald holding forth about his golf swing, Sandra adjusting the centerpiece with the precise, habitual care of a woman who has spent 40 years ensuring that things look correct. I want you to understand what it felt like to walk into that dining room that night, to sit at that table, to be Raymond Decker, just an old man who likes gardening, according to his son-in-law, and to look down the table at Claire's face, which was composed and careful and working very hard at being composed and careful, and to feel the whole accumulated weight of the past 2 years pressing against the inside of my chest like a hand pushing on a door. I want you to understand it, because what happened next was not an accident, and it was not a performance. It was just something I had spent 43 years learning to do, and when the moment arrived, there was nothing to decide. The body goes, the hands go, the mind goes somewhere precise and clear and trained. And the rest of it, the long quiet life, the tomatoes, the gardening, the being underestimated at every comfortable, well-appointed dinner table, all of that steps aside without resentment and lets the hands do their work. Gerald had been talking about the golf handicap. He had by my count mentioned it 3 times during the meal, which was the kind of thing I noticed without intending to. Sandra had touched his arm twice. Marcus was working on his second glass of wine. Claire was passing the cranberry sauce to someone and saying something about the turkey. She was worried it had dried out, but it hadn't. It was perfect. She always worried. And I was watching the light on the table, the warm orange of the candles, and I was thinking about Helen and about how much she would have liked the yellow in the curtains in this room, too. Then Gerald said, "Oh." Just that. A single short syllable, with a texture to it that was completely wrong. His hand went to his chest. Then he was on the floor. The room froze. I have seen rooms freeze before. I have seen trained soldiers freeze. The freeze is not cowardice. It is simply the human body's first response to the completely unexpected, the half-second gap while the brain catches up to the eyes. In a civilian room with no training, that half-second can become 5 seconds, 10 seconds, a minute, and a minute is an eternity when someone's heart is struggling. I was already on my feet. My chair hit the wall. My glasses went in my pocket. 2 fingers at his neck, carotid artery, pressed firmly but not hard. And I was counting and measuring, and the data was poor but not catastrophic. Pulse present, weak and irregular. Breathing compromised, color wrong. Responsive to touch and voice. Not a full arrest. Not yet, but close enough to the edge that every second had weight. "Call 911, I said, and my voice did what it does. Calm, flat, just loud enough to penetrate the frozen air. "Right now. 114 Birchwood Court. Suspected cardiac event, male, 68 years old, conscious but deteriorating. Tell them he's on the floor in the prone position and someone is with him. Go." I heard someone, Sandra, I think, say, "Oh God, oh God, oh God," in a repeating loop. I said, "Sandra, look at me." She looked. "He is okay right now. He is conscious. The people on the phone will help you. Look at your phone. Dial. Now." She dialed. Her hands were shaking hard enough that it took her 2 tries, but she got through. I turned back to Gerald. He was looking up at me with the particular terrifying clarity of someone who knows exactly how serious this is. "Gerald," I said, "I need you to breathe slowly. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Can you do that?" He tried. The breath was ragged at first. Then it smoothed slightly. "Good. Keep going. Stay with that. You're doing fine." I was loosening his collar, checking the pulse again at 30-second intervals, monitoring the color in his face, watching for changes. I'd been assessing him for signs of ST elevation, for the specific constellation of symptoms that would tell me whether this was cardiac arrest presenting, a severe anginal episode, or something else, a pulmonary embolism, a severe hypotensive event. The symptoms so far pointed most strongly to a significant cardiac episode, but he was maintaining consciousness and a perfusing rhythm, which was something. "Has he had heart trouble before?" I asked the room, without looking up. Marcus said from somewhere behind me, in a voice I didn't entirely recognize. There was something 3 years ago. They said it was a warning. He takes something for it, his medication." "What medication? Do you know the name?" "Mom," Marcus said. "Then, metoprolol. And something for cholesterol, I don't remember." "Is there aspirin in the house?" "Yes." This was Claire, clear and immediate, already moving toward the kitchen. 325 milligrams if you have it. Regular strength tablet, not coated, bring it." She was back in 45 seconds with the bottle. I opened it, shook out 2 regular strength tablets, and helped Gerald get them under his tongue. "Don't swallow," I told him. "Let them dissolve." "Good. Just keep breathing." The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes, which was a good response time for that neighborhood on a holiday evening. I heard the sirens from 2 blocks out, and I stayed where I was, maintaining the assessment, talking to Gerald in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, his golf game actually, which I figured was a subject he could hold on to, until the front door opened and the crew came through with the stretcher and the defibrillator and the trained, brisk confidence that I knew in my bones. The lead paramedic, a young woman, probably 30, with the kind of face that stays completely professional while the eyes take in everything, crouched beside me and said, "Sir, can you give me a status report?" I gave it to her. Heart rate, respiratory rate, my timeline of observations, the aspirin I'd administered and when, the medication history I'd gathered, the absence of any documented allergies that anyone in the room could confirm. I gave it the way I'd given 1,000 reports, efficiently, without extraneous information in the order that mattered. She looked at me for just a half-second longer than the information required. "What's your background?" she said. "Combat medic," I said. "Retired. 21 years Army, then 12 years as a civilian trauma consultant." She nodded once, the way professionals nod when they're recalibrating quickly. "You did good," she said. "He's in good shape, all things considered." They moved Gerald onto the stretcher. Sandra was already getting her coat. Marcus was on his phone, calling someone. His sister, I thought, and Claire was standing just behind me, and when I stood up and turned around, she put both her hands on my face, just held my face in her hands the way she hadn't done since she was maybe 8 years old. And she said, "Dad?" And her voice broke completely on that single syllable, and I put my arms around her and held on. It was Marcus's voice that came next, quiet and close and stripped of everything it usually wore. "Wait," he said. "How do you know how to do that?" I let go of Claire. I looked at my son-in-law. He was standing very still, his wine glass abandoned on the table behind him, his face doing something complicated that I don't think he had planned or chosen. He looked, for maybe the first time since I had known him, like someone who wasn't sure what performance was appropriate for this particular moment, because the performance he had available, the one he used for dealing with the quiet old man who likes gardening, didn't fit what he had just watched. Because I spent 21 years being the person whose job was to make sure that people who needed help got it, I said. And then another 12 after that. He stared at me. I saw him processing it. I saw the map he had drawn of me rearranging itself in real time, the furniture of his assumptions moving around, settling into configurations he hadn't anticipated. "Claire never told me," he said. "You never asked," I said. And I said it without heat because I meant it without heat. It was simply true. He looked at her. She was looking back at him with an expression I couldn't fully read from where I was standing, but I could see the edges of it, steady and sad and old. Too old for someone 33 years of age. The house emptied gradually after that. The neighbors who had heard the commotion retreated. Marcus left for the hospital with his mother. Claire and I sat in the kitchen in the aftermath of the meal, the plates still on the table, the candles still burning, the turkey half carved, and she made tea because there was nothing else to do with her hands. We sat across from each other for a while without talking. Biscuit had materialized from wherever he'd been hiding during the excitement and placed his head on Claire's knee, and she scratched his ears with the automatic comfort of someone grateful for an uncomplicated affection. "How long have you known?" she said. "That something was wrong? A while?" "How long is a while?" "Since Easter, for certain. Before that, I suspected." She looked at her tea. "I thought I was hiding it." "You were," I said. "From most people, not from me." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's not... He doesn't hit me, Dad. I want you to know that." "Okay," I said. "It's just... It's other things. The way he talks to me when no one else can hear. The way he makes me feel like everything I do is slightly wrong. The way I've started checking his face before I say anything, any time, to see if it's safe." She said that last sentence very carefully, like she was reading it from somewhere inside herself where she'd been keeping it for a long time. I have seen people say things they have been rehearsing internally for months, and there is a particular quality to the words when they finally come out. Fragile and exact. "That's enough," I said. "I know," she said. "I know it is. I wanted to make sure I was right. That it wasn't just me being... It's not just you," I said. She nodded. She held her tea with both hands. Outside, the night was full and dark and cold, and the street was quiet, and it was Thanksgiving, and somewhere across town Gerald Whitmore was in an ambulance being kept alive by strangers, and I was sitting across from my daughter, who was telling me, quietly and with great precision, that she was afraid in her own house, and the weight of it was something I felt in every part of me at once. "Claire," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Okay? Do you feel safe?" She was quiet for a long time. "I feel safer when you're here," she said. I nodded. I put my hand over both of hers on the mug. We sat like that for a while. "I'm going to stay," I said. "You don't have to." "I'm going to stay for a few days," I said. "We can figure out the rest from there." She didn't argue. Gerald survived. That's the first thing to say. He was in the hospital for 4 days, monitored, evaluated, and sent home with an adjusted medication plan and strongly worded instructions about his diet and activity level that Gerald, by all accounts, immediately began negotiating with his cardiologist. He made a full functional recovery. The doctor at the hospital told Marcus afterward, in terms that Marcus relayed to Claire and Claire relayed to me, that the intervention in those first minutes had been significant, that the aspirin administration and the positional management and the consistent monitoring of his breathing had made a measurable difference. The doctor said whoever was with him knew what they were doing, Claire told me. I said, good. The days after Thanksgiving were strange and quiet and full of a particular suspended time quality that I remembered from other turning points. The days after Helen's diagnosis, the days after leaving the army, the days after certain missions that couldn't be discussed, but that left a kind of residue in the air around you. Marcus came home from the hospital on the second day. He was subdued in a way I hadn't seen before. The performance turned down very low, or perhaps simply exhausted, the way a certain kind of person exhausts themselves without being aware they're performing at all. He sat down across from me in the living room on the second evening while Claire was upstairs, and he said, I owe you an apology. I said, for which part? He was surprised by that. I watched him manage the surprise. For all of it. The way I've talked about you, the things I assumed. That I wouldn't know how to do anything useful. Yes. He paused. That you were retired, and that was the whole of it. I didn't know. You didn't ask, I said again. And you're right. I could have offered more. I don't generally. It's not my habit to list my credentials. But you made assumptions, and you acted on them, and some of those actions affected your wife. That's the part that matters. He looked at the floor between his shoes. He was a handsome man. He was a smart man. And he was sitting across from me in his own living room looking more uncertain than I suspected he had looked since childhood. I know things aren't right, he said. Between us. Between Claire and me. I know you know, I said. Is she? He stopped. You need to talk to her, I said. Not to me. She's the one you need to talk to. He nodded. I said, Marcus, I want to say something to you, and I want you to hear it without defending against it. Can you do that? He looked up. I'll try. The way you speak to her when you think nobody important is listening, it matters. It accumulates. It becomes the water she swims in, and eventually she can't remember what it felt like to swim in water that wasn't that. You understand what I'm saying? He was very still. Yes, he said. Whatever you do next, I said, needs to take that seriously. He said, okay. I got up. I went to the kitchen and made tea for the second night in a row in a house that wasn't mine. Biscuit followed me with the faithful, unhurried loyalty of a very old dog who goes where his person goes, and I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark backyard and thought about Helen. The way I always think about Helen when there's a difficult thing to think through. Because she was always clearer on these questions than I was. And even gone, she is clearer. Claire came to me 3 weeks later. She drove up to Millhaven on a Saturday, the week before Christmas, and she sat at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where she had done homework as a teenager and eaten breakfast as a child and cried after her first real heartbreak at 17. And she said, I want to leave. I think I'm ready to leave. I just don't know if I can do it. Tell me what you need to do it, I said. She thought about it. I need to know I have somewhere to go. I need to know I'm not failing. You have somewhere to go, I said. This house, immediately, or whenever you need, as long as you need, and you're not failing. The only failure here is not taking care of yourself. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think it counts? What happened to me? It wasn't... I know there are people who have it so much worse. I don't want to be someone who... Stop, I said. She stopped. It counts, I said. That question is a trap he set, even if he didn't know he was setting it. Whether you counted enough to deserve help. The answer is yes. Always yes. She started crying then, finally the full kind, not the managed, controlled, self-monitoring kind I'd been watching her manage for 2 years. She cried for a while, and I sat with her, and Biscuit put his great gray head on her knee and sighed, and she laughed a little through the crying, which is the sound of someone who still has their sense of humor about themselves, and I was grateful for it. She filed for separation in January. She'd spent the weeks before Christmas quietly, carefully doing what she'd learned to do professionally, gathering documentation, recording, noting dates and incidents with the same methodical attention to detail that she brought to environmental compliance reports, because that's who Claire Decker was, at her core: thorough, careful, and absolutely not someone to underestimate. She had a lawyer by the time she told Marcus. His name was Dennis Farrell, a small man from Chesterfield County with a reputation for patient, exhaustive preparation and a complete absence of drama, which was exactly what this needed. Dennis had told Claire, at their first meeting, "I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. Some of them will be uncomfortable. Answer all of them completely and we'll be fine." She had answered all of them. They were fine. Marcus's initial response to the separation papers was the response I had expected. Surprise, then protest, then a period of negotiation, then a period of anger, then a period of a particular kind of emotional pressure that Dennis had also anticipated and prepared Claire for. There were long phone calls I heard about secondhand, and a few that Claire took in the living room while I was in the kitchen, during which I could hear her voice staying level and steady in a way that I knew cost her something, and I was proud of her in those moments with a pride that was complicated and quiet, and too large to say out loud. The formal proceedings were what formal proceedings are: procedural, slow, occasionally absurd, and completely necessary. I want to tell you about one day in February, sitting in a courthouse hallway in Richmond with Dennis Farrell on one side and Claire on the other, waiting for a hearing. I had come not as a witness, but as a presence, which is sometimes the only form of help available, and also the most important one. There was a moment, sitting in that hallway on a hard wooden bench with bad overhead lighting, and the smell of old building and institutional coffee, when Claire reached over and took my hand the way she hadn't since she was about 6 years old, and we were at the doctor's office and she was afraid of the needle. She just took it and held on. I held back. When it was her turn to speak in that hearing, she stood up, and she was entirely Claire. She was precise and complete, and she said what needed to be said without ornament and without performance. And at one point she said simply, "I stopped feeling safe in my own home." That is the clearest thing I can tell you about what this was. And she sat back down. The judge, a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looked at her for a moment after she was done, and then moved on to the next item on her list, which is what judges do. But there was something in that look that I recognized. It was the look of someone seeing another person clearly. I did testify, in a later proceeding. I said what I had seen. I said it in the same flat, precise voice I use for everything. And I did not editorialize, and I did not exaggerate, because the facts were sufficient, and the facts were mine to tell, and I told them. Dennis asked me afterward in the parking lot if I'd ever testified before. "A few times," I said. "Military?" "Twice there, yes, and in civilian courts, malpractice cases mostly, consulting work." He looked at me with the expression of a man revising his estimate. "You're very calm on the stand." "Thank you," I said. "That was a compliment," he said. "I know," I said. The divorce was finalized in April. Marcus, to his credit, did not fight the terms aggressively. He had a lawyer who was good enough to tell him when a position was untenable, and he listened. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. There was a morning when a set of documents was signed by two people and witnessed by their lawyers, and that was that. Claire called me from the parking lot, which is where she always seems to make the important calls, and she said, "It's done," and her voice was calm and genuine, and I could hear in it the first real quiet I'd heard there in years. She moved into a small apartment in Richmond's Museum District in March, before the divorce was final, a 2-bedroom place on the second floor of a converted row house, with tall windows and original brick walls and a kitchen that was small but workable, and a second bedroom that she set up as a home office, and which, she informed me, would always have a fold-out couch in it, and would always be ready for me whenever I wanted to come down and use it. I came down on the first weekend after she moved in. We put the furniture together. She had bought some flat-pack things from a Swedish furniture store and navigated the instructions with the same focused competence she brought to everything, and I put up shelves in the kitchen while she organized the books. Biscuit wandered the new space with the investigative intensity of a dog encountering unknown smells, and eventually settled in a patch of afternoon light on the living room floor and declared the apartment acceptable. That evening we ordered pizza, something we hadn't done together since she was in college, and sat on the floor because the couch hadn't arrived yet, and ate it from the box, and the light was good, and the apartment was quiet, and she looked around at her own space, truly her own, chosen, safe, and she said, "I'd forgotten what this felt like." "What?" I said. "Quiet, that doesn't mean something bad is about to happen." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "Me too, in my own way." She looked at me. "Your mother's house," I said, after she was gone. It took me a long time before quiet felt okay again, before it stopped being just the absence of her. She nodded slowly. "How did you get there?" I thought about it honestly, slowly and with help, and by deciding that the quiet was allowed to mean something else now. She was quiet herself for a moment. Then, "That's actually really good advice, Dad." "Don't tell anyone," I said. "It'll ruin the image." She laughed, really laughed, and reached over and took a piece of pizza and said, "I love you." And I said, "I love you too." And we finished the pizza, and it was a completely ordinary evening, and it was also, in the way that ordinary evenings sometimes are, the most important kind of beautiful. My life changed that year too, not in the dramatic way. There was no single moment for me the way the apartment was for Claire, no clean line of before and after, but things shifted. I went back to volunteering at the free clinic on Hartwell Road, and I mentioned to the director there, a focused, energetic woman named Dr. Priya Mehta, that I had a clinical background, more than I'd let on. She looked at me with a mix of exasperation and interest and said, "Why on earth have you been handling intake paperwork for 2 years?" And I said, "Because it needed doing," and she put me to work doing something more useful. Bill Calloway came by on a Saturday in June and said, with the directness of a man who's known you long enough to skip preamble, "You seem lighter lately." I said, "How do you mean?" He thought about it. "Like you put something down." I considered that. "I think I did," I said. He nodded once. We drank our coffee. He told me about a problem he was having with his gutters, which was not related to any of this, but which was the kind of conversation that matters in its own right. Father Augusto, at chess that Thursday, looked at me over the board when I made an unexpectedly aggressive move with my bishop and said, "You're playing differently." "Am I?" "You're not holding back," he said. "Maybe I'm just getting better," I said. "You've been getting better for 3 years," he said. "But this is different. This is permitted." I looked at him across the board. This small, peaceful man who had listened to more human complexity in his years than most people encounter in 10 lifetimes. "That's a good word for it," I said. He moved his knight. "Your move." The letter from Marcus came in September. A real letter. Paper, handwritten, in an envelope addressed to both of us separately. 2 copies, one that arrived at my address in Millhaven, and one that Claire received at her apartment. She called me the same day we each received them, and we talked about it for almost an hour, trading sentences back and forth across the phone in the way of 2 people working something out together. The letter was 3 pages. His handwriting was smaller than I expected, careful, compressed, slightly too controlled, like a man doing something with his hands that he was afraid of getting wrong. He said he had been in therapy since February, which I had not known. He said he had been learning things about himself and about patterns of behavior that he was ashamed of and that he had not understood, while they were happening, as harmful. He said he was not asking for anything. He was not asking for forgiveness, he wrote, because he did not believe that was something that could be asked for. He said he hoped Claire was well. He said, and I had to read this part twice, that he hoped I knew he was sorry, and that he was glad I had been there on Thanksgiving, and that he meant both of those things separately from each other. He also said, in the final paragraph, "I used to think that quiet people were people who didn't have anything to say. I understand now that some of them are simply waiting for the moment when saying something will actually matter." Claire asked me what I thought of it. I sat for a moment with that. "I think he meant it," I said. "So do I," she said. "I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it right now," I said. "You can just let it be true without it requiring a response." She was quiet for a moment. Then, do you forgive him? I thought about it honestly. I don't think I have the same thing to forgive that you do, I said. He was rude to me. He underestimated me. That's a mistake, not a wound. What he did to you is different. That's yours. Does that mean you forgive the part that's yours? I think so, I said. Not because it didn't matter, but because holding it doesn't help either of us, and because a man who writes a letter like that is in the process of becoming something better than what he was. You're more generous than I am, she said. No, I said. I just have more years of practice at letting things go. She didn't respond to the letter. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She hadn't decided. I told her neither path was wrong, and I meant it. My granddaughter, not a biological granddaughter, but that's the word we use, is Claire's friend, Rachel's daughter, Lily, who is 7 years old and has been calling me Grandpa Ray since she was 4 because her own grandfather lives in Portland and she is generous with titles. Lily came to Millhaven with her mother in October, one of those bright, cold autumn Saturdays that Virginia does with particular beauty, and we spent the afternoon in the garden even though there wasn't much left in it this time of year. Mostly clearing and composting, and putting things to bed for the winter. Lily followed me from bed to bed with the absolute concentration of a 7-year-old, engaged with something she finds genuinely interesting, asking questions with the unfiltered directness that is one of the greatest gifts of that age. Grandpa Ray, she said, pulling on her work gloves with great seriousness. Did something bad happen to Claire? I looked at her. What makes you ask that? Because Mama talks about her in a careful way, like when something bad happened but it's getting better. I considered the question and the asker. Yes, I said. Something hard happened, but Claire's doing really well now. Did you help? A little. She pulled a dead plant stalk with enormous satisfaction. How? I just stayed close, I said, and paid attention. She thought about this. My friend Cora's dad says that's what dads are supposed to do. Cora's dad is right, I said. Were you scared? I thought about the honest answer to that. A little, but being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you're paying good attention. She nodded with the gravity of someone filing this information for future use. Then she said, Can we put the tomatoes back in the spring? Absolutely, I said. Good, she said, and moved on to the next bed. Gerald Whitmore and I have spoken twice since Thanksgiving. Once on the phone, about 3 weeks after he was discharged from the hospital. He called to thank me, which I had not expected, and he did it with a directness and simplicity that I found I liked. He didn't overdo it. He said, I understand you kept me alive. I want you to know I don't take that lightly. I said, I'm glad you're okay, Gerald. He said, So am I. So am I. And then he asked about my garden, which made me smile. The second time was in the summer. He was visiting Marcus, and they drove up to Millhaven, just Gerald, without Sandra, which surprised me a little. And I made coffee, and we sat on the back porch, and he watched Biscuit amble around the yard, and he said without preamble, My son is a work in progress. Most people are, I said. He didn't treat Claire right, he said. No. I don't know how much of it is my fault. What I modeled. What he saw. I looked at him. He was asking a real question. I don't know either, I said. But the fact that you're asking it is worth something. He was quiet for a while, looking at the yard. What you did that night. I didn't know who you were. I mean, I knew you were Marcus's. I knew you were Claire's father. But I didn't know you. Most people don't, I said. It's fine. It shouldn't be, he said. I didn't respond to that, but I thought about it. Sitting there in the October light with an old man I'd had no particular reason to like, and had found improbably to be decent company. I thought about all the people who move through the world and are not seen clearly by the people standing next to them, and about whether that is always someone's fault, or whether it is sometimes just the accidental geometry of how we arrange our attention and our assumptions. I am 64 years old. I have been a soldier and a medic and a consultant and a widower and a father and, for a difficult period, a worried man sitting in Millhaven waiting for a phone call that he hoped would never come. I have held people while they were dying, I have helped people while they were healing. I have sat with silence and with grief and with the specific, demanding, unrelenting work of loving someone across the full, complicated distance of a human relationship. I have also grown tomatoes. The tomatoes are good. I am not embarrassed about the tomatoes. Here is what I learned. What all of this, the years and the training and the long Thanksgiving evening on the floor of a dining room and the slow, patient, necessary winter that came after. What all of it taught me. Strength isn't announcing itself. It doesn't come in where it doesn't feel welcome and demand to be seen. It waits. It tends its garden. It has coffee with its neighbor on Saturday mornings and plays chess on Thursday evenings, and it shows up when it's needed and it does what needs to be done, and then it goes home. The world is full of quiet people who have done enormous things that nobody knows about because they were not doing those things for an audience. They were doing them because the moment was there and the skill was there and a person needed help. Strength isn't winning fights. Strength is answering the phone when somebody is afraid. Strength is knowing the distress signal your daughter invented and waiting every single day to never have to hear it, and being ready for it anyway, just in case. Strength is sitting on a back porch in October with a man you barely know and telling him the truth as gently as you can, because the truth, gently told, is still the truth. Love is not the absence of fear. Love is being afraid and staying anyway. Love is watching someone make choices you wouldn't make and holding the space for them to find their own way, and holding the door open when they're finally ready to walk through it, and not saying, "I told you so," because "I told you so" is for people who love being right more than they love the person in front of them. And family, real family, the kind you build and tend and fight for, is not the family that shows up for the beautiful moments. It's the family that shows up for the floor of a Thanksgiving dining room, for the courthouse hallway, for the flat-pack furniture on a Saturday afternoon, for the quiet evenings with bad pizza and good light, when someone is finally learning what it feels like to be safe. That is what I know. That is what my 64 years and my 43 years of training and my one extraordinary ordinary life have taught me. I want to say one more thing before I go, and I want to say it to you directly, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever it is you're carrying right now that I don't know about. You might be the person at the table who everyone thinks they have figured out. The quiet one, the retired one, the one who likes gardening. And I want you to know that being underestimated is not the same as being small. Your depth belongs to you, and you don't owe anyone a demonstration of it until the moment arrives when it matters. And when that moment comes, as it always does, you will know what to do. Trust what you've lived. Trust your hands. Or you might be someone sitting in a house that doesn't feel safe, managing the weather of someone else's moods, checking faces before you speak, forgetting what quiet felt like before it meant something was wrong. And I want you to know, it counts. Whatever it is, it counts. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to ask for help. You are allowed to call someone who loves you and say, quietly, the thing you've been keeping inside, and they will stay on the line. And if you've never been either of those people, if you're simply someone sitting with a phone or a screen, listening to an old man tell you about the best and worst Thanksgiving of his life, then I hope something in this story reached you. I hope it reminded you that the people standing next to you are deeper than you know. That the ones who say the least sometimes have the most to give. That the moment when everything changes tends to look right up until it arrives, like just another evening. If this story moves something in you, please leave me a comment below and tell me about it. Tell me about someone you love. Tell me about a moment when someone showed up for you when it mattered most. Tell me anything. I read them. I think about them. And they mean more than you probably realize to an old man sitting on his back porch in Millhaven with a golden retriever at his feet and a garden full of things that are only just beginning to grow. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, please do. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like on this video, and come back, because I have more stories to tell, and I mean every word of them. My name is Raymond Earl Decker. I am 64 years old. I am a retired combat medic, a trauma consultant, a gardener, a widower, a father, and the man who was on the floor of a Thanksgiving dining room when his son-in-law finally looked at him and asked the question he'd never thought to ask before. And the answer, it turned out, was everything.